what happens if you suddenly see the Fed balance sheet rising to $10 trillion very quickly? All that's going to do is accelerate the rush to get out of US Treasuries. So if they're really serious about doing this, it's absolute insanity. And I never say never, but I really would
Come on,
be
Paul. This is
extremely
this is the
surprised.
U.S. government. Let's give them credit.
Oh,
It's no
yeah.
idea too stupid. Hello there, my friends. Chris Marcus here with you for Arcadia Economics, and I am with London Paul of the Sirius Report. Gave us a couple great interviews this week, but fortunately, while all the topics were great, Paul, it's hard to have you on without getting the latest update on the Ponzi scheme U.S. Treasury market that the government and Wall Street is running here. Um, I'll try and behave myself. I have so many funny comments I've been saving up, since the last time we talked. I mean, they just give you so much material, especially that Reuters article last week. Now, to be clear, it wasn't a Trump quote, although I'm guessing the guy wasn't just sitting in his cube making this one up one afternoon, but he was suggesting of why Trump should stick it to China and find a way to use sanctions or some way to effectively default, which to me seems odd if this is the safe haven and now it's whether the U.S. government likes you or not that determines whether you get repaid. But Paul, obviously you're an expert on this fantastical topic, so I will let you take it away, sir.
Well, okay, yeah, let's start with the whole US-China thing. It is quite staggering that, yeah, I mean, you might think, you might have a joke or two about, well, maybe we could stick it to China by balking on well, it's not 1.1 trillion. I mean, the amount of treasuries China holds is significantly less, but just for the sake of argument, you might joke about that, but they're actually giving it serious consideration doing it. I mean, you would have thought that, they would have thought, for a split second what that would do. I mean, it would create immense market volatility. It will most certainly destroy the dollar status as the world's reserve currency, even though, of course, it's being destroyed anyway. But Trump seems to have no problem in principle reneging on those obligations. And, to back this up, I think this is election optics again, because the big understanding is, and I think it's pretty obvious already, that his election campaign is going to be all this anti-Chinese sentiment and seeking to blame China for the US economic demise because of the pandemic, which, that China is completely responsible for, and what the US did in the intervening period is not really up for discussion. So what if they did this? What would they have to do? Well, in principle, they'd have to default on government borrowings from China. But it appears, of course, Trump doesn't realize the implication of such an act in terms of all the other US Treasury holders. Because let's face it, if I was sat there going, hang on, they're defaulting with China, well, maybe we're next in line because they're upset we did X, Y, and Z. So
Yep.
maybe it's time to dump the treasuries as well, which we know, of course, nations have been dumping enormous amounts of treasuries, and the Fed was trying to be, sweet talk them into not doing that by taking part in currency swaps. But I'm digressing somewhat. Well, the problem with this is the US Treasury, ironically, has very limited visibility of individual securities because they're held in accounts at Federal Reserve banks. And what's the likelihood? China may have bought through intermediaries, they may have bought abroad, and there's no real way of being able to track these. But one thing defaulting would do, you create this sort of tsunami through the what $18 trillion treasury markets. It would also end any hope, not that anyone wants to buy US debt in terms of foreign buyers, but they're most certainly not going to buy them after that. Now, default's technically forbidden by the Constitution, but I don't think government's particularly interested in the Constitution, so they'll just say, okay,
Why would
we're
it
going to
matter
ignore
now?
that. Yes, exactly. So of course, even though the US can't refuse to pay its debts, it can bypass the problem. The Trump administration could demand, for example, banks hold any payment of interest or principal to any account held by a Chinese government counterparty, presuming they can find them. Maybe they could even resort to freezing assets or demand they're seized. I mean, effectively, that would be tantamount to the US imposing sanctions on China. But Trump could, or his administration, argue it's not a default because the other holders of US government debt will be paid. I mean, it gets into very, very, very sort of grey, murky areas. Now, there's a thing called the International Emergency Economics Power Act, the IEEPA. Of course, at any time that grants the president these incredible, or power in inverted commas, to seize property and assets of nations that are perceived as an extraordinary threat. Now, technically, given the virus has been cited as a national emergency, the US could technically claim China's responsible and that they were attacked, therefore, by China due to the virus. So, he could then potentially, Trump, confiscate property. And the truth is, he's threatened to use this act before, and obviously when he deployed bans of US companies from investing in China. Only recently, they invoked this ban importing power grid equipment for what were deemed as foreign adversaries. Now, of course, delaying payments doesn't permit the US from the obligation to pay. But this is really just an absolute minefield, and there's no good way out of this. But for some reason, Trump will see this as a vote winner at home with his supporters. He'll just say, I'm reneging on the debt with China, and it'll look like he's, standing tall and tough against China, which his voter base will greatly appreciate. What, of course, he fails to appreciate in the same breath is probably going to cost him the election if he does this, because the fallout of doing this will be catastrophic for US Treasuries. It'll be catastrophic for the US economy, the dollar, the bond markets. And the truth is, China has enough financial muscle to launch at the US, never mind this market reaction or the collapse of US Treasuries and bond markets. And here's the problem. Imagine if suddenly we have trillions of dollars being dumped in a short space of time, or Treasuries. I mean, the Fed's going to have to buy them all up because no one else will. So what happens if you suddenly see the Fed balance sheet rising to $10 trillion very quickly? All that's going to do is accelerate the rush to get out of US Treasuries. So the mere act of doing this could affect, as I say, cost him his election, even though he thinks it's great optics for his voter base. But if they're really serious about doing this, it's absolute insanity. And I never say never, but I really would.
Come on, Paul. This is the U.S. government. Let's give them credit.
Oh, yeah.
No idea too stupid. I mean, this is. I get what you're saying, and it's like on one hand, it does seem insane. But again, I mean, we're talking about the same government that, will stick to just one example. I mean, they knew there weren't weapons of mass destruction. It wasn't an accident. We have the documentation. These guys knew, they lied about it. So, I mean, it's hard to say what you wouldn't put past them. Because at the same time, yeah, that sounds insane. Although on one hand or another, there's a default coming. Now, if you want to say far more likely is the sneaky, dishonest, implicit default where they just run the printing presses until, a slice of pizza costs $200,000, I'd probably think that's likely what will happen. Again, I did think it was interesting having Trump come in here. He does have that extensive bankruptcy experience and seems like the kind of guy that would at least be willing to say, all right, we're restructuring. Someone was telling me a story about him where maybe 20 years ago he had a couple bankers in the room and he's like, all right, this is what I'm going to give you. I'm going to declare bankruptcy. So are these guys not just specifically to Trump, but I mean, all of these foreign leaders and presidents, they act as if they have nothing to see here, no idea what's going on. Are they really that oblivious? It's hard to believe that they are. So you would think there's something being planned somewhere by someone, or are we really just in some bizarro Keynesian world where these guys actually believe that stuff?
Well, yeah, it's a great question, and probably it was better we never tried to get inside the head of these people because it's
Yeah,
probably
I don't want to
it's
taint your soul there. So it's like you need a
but
full Aura body condom to get through some of this nonsense.
absolutely. I mean, I think we'll talk about the Fed, and obviously, everybody knows that the Fed's now effectively in a position to just hoover up anything and everything: corporate bonds, asset-backed securities, commercial paper, ETFs, you name it, whatever's available, they're there to hoover it up. And I mean, how much of the US Treasury market's the Fed going to end up owning in 6 months or 3 months or 9 months or whatever? And of course, they then set up all these funding facilities. There was a CPFF, that's the commercial paper funding facility, that buys commercial paper from the issuer. There was a primary market corporate credit facility, the PMCCF, that's buying corporate bonds from an issuer. You've got TALF, the term asset-backed securities loan facilities, that's a funding backstop, of course, for asset-backed securities. You've got this secondary market corporate credit facility, the SMCCF. They're going to buy corporate bonds and bond ETFs in the secondary market. You've got this MSBLP, the Main Street Business Lending Program. So it's eligible to, in notionally at least, to lend to small and medium-sized businesses. Now, the thing that's interesting about all this is the reality is the Fed isn't allowed to do that. The central bank is only allowed to purchase or lend against securities that, of course, have government guarantees. So that includes Treasury securities, obviously agency mortgage-backed securities, and debt issued by, say, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. So what did they do to get around this legal minefield? Well, the Fed created all these wonderful SPVs, or special purpose vehicles, for each of what I've just listed to conduct these operations. So effectively, the Treasury, using the Exchange Stabilization Fund, is going to make an equity investment in each SPV and be in a first loss position. So what's actually happening is the US Treasury, not the Fed, is buying all these securities and backstopping of loans. The Fed merely acts as a banker and provides financing. The Fed, therefore, themselves hired BlackRock. They purchase all these securities and handle the administration of the SPVs on behalf of the US Treasury. So in other words, the federal government is going to look to nationalize large sections of the financial markets. The Fed's providing the money to do it. The Exchange Stabilization Fund controls the Fed. This has been the case for probably since the inception of the ESF, although I'm not exactly sure it is exactly that point. But that's all they're admitting. So what it effectively amounts to is the ESF is now admitting it controls the printing press and will utilize the SPVs to make the Fed print whatever it takes to buy up whatever it needs to buy to ensure the asset bubbles keep inflating, to try and ensure effectively Trump gets re-elected in November. So the Fed, which is the conduit, is doing what its master, the ESF, wants it to do, which is controlled by the deep state, in part process that it's going to destroy the dollar, create hyperinflation, and wreck the lives of all American people forever. I mean, so what are they hoping they could somehow achieve in this? Well, they're just hoping hyperinflation or serious inflation doesn't hit Main Street until after the November elections. But the virus in this regard has thrown this massive curveball into the equation. because these enormous bailouts were going to happen irrespective. The virus is just this cover, but it's also exacerbating the problem, increasing the need for bailouts and accelerating the death spiral for the dollar. And of course, we've seen all these enormous stimulus packages for trillions of dollars. I mean, the Fed came out and said, well, in Q2, yeah, well, maybe we'll just need to print another $3 trillion. But hey, don't worry, it's not a problem because we can just keep printing. But the problem is eventually the money velocity is going to increase. And Mnuchin said the other day, oh, we're going to start to see all this money work in the real US economy. Well, he's just admitting that the money is going to go into Main Street. When the money hits Main Street, then you're going to start getting inflation. And yeah, we're already seeing inflation. I mean, is not the gigantic stock market bubble inflation? Is the property market bubble inflation? Are we seeing increased prices in food? Yeah, that's inflation. So, but we're talking about inflation on a scale that we currently can't comprehend. And they'll just do whatever it takes. But the question is this all going to blow up before November? Because I've always said if everything blows up before November, I don't give Trump much of a chance of being re-elected, in all honesty. And what this also shows is because the ESF can purchase or sell foreign currencies to hold the US foreign exchange and to provide financing to financial governments. Therefore, all the operations of the ESF require the authorization of the Secretary of the Treasury, i.e. Steve Mnuchin. So Mnuchin is therefore responsible for the formulation and implementation of US international monetary and financial policy, including exchange market intervention policy. So by definition, he has considerable leverage in the use of ESF resources. So Mnuchin now controls US monetary and fiscal policy. Something we mentioned a long time ago was the case, but now they're having to admit it. Now, that's a very concerning development because admitting it means they're going to utilize this in ways which we've never seen before. The consequences are going to be devastating for the US economy and the people. And the argument would be, well, the deep states just hijacked the US financial system on an even bigger scale than before, and people are imagining the Fed's the problem. They changed the rules, of course, to ensure the Fed's the conduit, but even the Fed is immune to the fallout of what's coming, and the intention is to make the central bank survive. Not because the central bank is nothing more than a conduit, but if the central bank's destroyed in the process, well, that's going to create seismic problems in the process. But this is reality. So when I see all these comments about how, oh well, now the Treasury is controlling the Fed, and Trump's got the deep state on the back foot. Well, it's absolutely not the case. It's the complete reverse, because the ESF is the dark heart of the deep state cabal in the United States. And what we've just eloquently seen is they have more control now, arguably, than they've ever had in the history of, 90 years now.
Yeah, I mean, Paul, I'm not sure what is the appropriate response to Steve Mnuchin and Goldman Sachs having control of the world's economy, other than I think I'm going to go track down my $1,200 check, see if I can convert that into some silver today. I mean, it's on one hand, I mean, I guess I'm trying to bring a little light to it, because I mean, it's disturbing in the sense that anything that I've studied in my career, almost 20 plus years now in finance, I mean, geez, this is beyond. I mean, we thought what would happen in 2008 was wild. So now to see this happening, and hopefully, again, that's why I appreciate folks like you who speak up and expose these things, because I don't know. I mean, to me, it seems like a broad day bank robbery, what we're witnessing. Paul, I'm sure you've read about the Federal Reserve, what they did during that week of September 11th, 2001, where, man, there was you could have gotten anything cleared there without documentation. You see the same thing happening now. And if it's someone you can trust, that's one thing. But unfortunately, these institutions are anything but that. So I appreciate you sharing that. Folks, in case you didn't see, there's actually 3 parts to this interview. Paul was kind enough to cover the oil market, also the gold and silver market. So check those out as well. And of course, if you love hearing this incredible knowledge Paul shares, you can get access to his great podcast, The Sirius Report, which is in the description link below and has just a lot of stuff that you simply won't find anywhere else. And if you're trading or investing, why do it blind when Paul it makes it for is it still $4.75 a month, Paul?
Yeah, we've never increased the price there. And people often say, well, it's very cheap, but we make it cheap because we want to make it inclusive for everyone. It's it's about getting more people and not charging exorbitant amounts, because we think that it's important that everybody has an opportunity to contribute, and therefore we've always kept the cost extremely cheap as a result of that, because we think that's fair for everybody. I mean, and I think that's just we're certainly not going to raise prices now, that's for sure. I mean, that would be extremely detrimental. But we have had lots of our subscribers saying they happily pay double the cost of what it is per month. But no, we'll keep it very cheap, because we think information, particularly at this time, is extremely important, and we always do things. We're not there to be very popular necessarily with a lot of people, but it's about the truth. It's about what's unfolding. And sometimes I will say things and people think I particularly dislike Trump, or I'm particularly pro-China, or I'm pro this, or I dislike that. Well, these are just statements of fact. It's just a fact. I'm not interested in personalities, and I'm not a fan or to the contrary of anything or anyone. These are just factual things. I mean, China's made huge inroads, and it continues to do so. And that doesn't mean I would agree with it or disagree with it. I'm just, merely trying to present what's unfolding, and that's what we try to do on a weekly basis, and look to try and find the interesting things that perhaps other people might miss or aren't aware of, because often there's little bits of things out there that are extremely enlightening that on face value seem pretty innocuous, and actually maybe at times pretty uninteresting.
Yeah, and I think that's a big, especially as a former professional trader, now just do my thing on my own here. But there's so much happening in the world, a lot of which isn't reported, and just having access to some of that information you share, I find it really helpful. And to be clear, that was $4.75 per month, not $475 a month, which I know there's some newsletters at that rate. And I would suggest that certainly for people who are actively investing, it'd probably even be worth that much. But yeah, that's right, folks, $4.75 a month. So what is that? See if my guerrilla math, somewhere between 50 and 60 bucks a year to know more than any of these guys on the Wall Street trading desks. I sat on one for a while, and there's no one who knows this stuff. So I think it's a bargain. Paul, I sure am grateful for all the time you shared with us today. A lot of great information in these 3 parts. So we'll look forward to catching up. And can you share the Twitter link so people can find you there as well?
Yeah, and well, thanks, Chris, and we really, appreciate coming on. It's always a pleasure to have a chat with you, and obviously you're a great supporter. I was subscribing as well, so we really appreciate that. Yeah, the Twitter handle's at the Sirius Report. That's obviously SIRIUS Report, and yeah, we're quite active on Twitter. We like to throw some ideas out there and give people some food for thought. We can be a little bit sort of throw some pretty sometimes controversial things out there that stimulate debate, and sometimes people don't like it, but it's not to be sort of just for the hell of doing it. It's just kind of, I feel there's certain times people in the West don't understand China the way they need to understand it, and sometimes I'll say things in it and people don't like it or think it's nonsense, but having spent quite a lot of time there on and off over the years, and spent a lot of time understanding it and talking to a lot of people there and trying to understand precisely what China's been doing, and also, of course, having the advantage of knowing the people who are the architects of the so-called reset and the people that they engaged with the Chinese and the Russians, and to sort of reignite all these things like the Belt Road Initiative and gold-backed currencies, and to sort of effectively pave the way for this future paradigm shift that we're in the middle of. That's also extremely helpful and made me have a better understanding of things. And I'll spend as long as it takes to understand certain things. And if sometimes it takes weeks, sometimes it can take months, sometimes it can take years. I mean, the Middle East is a great example of that. I can remember a decade ago thinking this is a minefield and talking to someone, and they said, it's like there's no other way, just dive in the deep end, try and swim, and you'll get a picture and understanding. And when you invest the time and effort, then you can start to see things and understand what's unfolding. And that's the same with everything we try to do, because that's the only way. It's the truth is everything now, and it's a priceless commodity in a world of illusion. So I hold my hat out to everyone who goes to the lengths they do to try and expose that, because essentially most of the world, or the financial world and the geopolitical world, and as we understand it, is illusionary. But we're starting to see more and more truth, and as the illusion gives way to reality, the reality becomes easier to expose. Because 5 years ago, talking about things we're talking now, people didn't believe it. They didn't think it was remotely possible we'd see negative interest rates, or the dollar collapsing, or the US economy collapsing, or enormous unemployment, or QE on steroids. But now it's there, and people go, oh, okay, I can understand it. It's real and it's tangible. So sometimes being years ahead of what the curve, so to speak, can create problems, but that's what we try to do. We're always trying to be ahead of what's coming, and okay, it isn't always understood or appreciated, but that doesn't matter. The important thing is to try and get that message out there, and an understanding, at least from our perspective, as soon as possible. And that's all any of us can do at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I think that's all you can really do. And I know full well how it's not always the easiest thing. I remember my introduction to Austrian economics was Peter Schiff, and I'd listen to him talk about how 2005, 2006, he'd go to the family party and talk about the real estate market being a bubble, and they just didn't want to hear it. And I get that, but again, I also have a great deal of respect for folks like you that, you can't always tell people what you want to hear, but for those people who want to be proactive, again, to me, it was thinking, geez, this mortgage bubble, if I had been looking in the right places, I could have seen that in advance, which is what led me to start seeing the next one in advance and making preparations while I still could. And just appreciate that you provide a lot of great information that I personally find helpful. I know from the comments in our last video that the people watching did as well. So, Paul, I thank you again, sir, for joining me today. We'll look forward to doing this again. And folks, if you're still wanting more information of why these wild things are happening, well, just stay tuned, because there's another video coming your way now.